This video will offer an explanation of the endpoint synchronization status as seen within the endpoint status menu on the DLP web UI. Generally, for an endpoint to consider itself synchronized with the endpoint server, the policy version, fingerprinting version, and the profile version must match what has currently been deployed on the environment. The policy version can be found through the Policy Management menu under DLP Policies or Discovery Policies. The number is shown on the right side of the screen and is incremented whenever a policy change is made on the web UI. For the fingerprinting version, it is also found under the Policy Management menu under Content Classifiers. Select either File or Database Fingerprinting to confirm the number. To check the endpoint profile version, navigate to Deployment under Settings and select Endpoint Profiles. The endpoint profile version will increment as changes are made within the endpoint profiles themselves. Depending on the profile the endpoint is in, the profile version may vary across the environment. In this example, we have an endpoint that is showing as unsynchronized in the endpoint status menu. As seen in the right pane of the endpoint status menu, various pieces of information regarding the endpoint are available, such as the policy engine version and the various profile, policy, and fingerprinting versions that it has reported. In this case, the endpoint is unsynced because a policy change has been made and deployed on the environment to increment the policy version to 7. However, this endpoint has not updated to this version yet. In order to resolve the issue, confirm on the local environment if the endpoint is able to update successfully by clicking on the Update button. If desired, a tool such as PsExec can be used to manually force an update of the endpoint over the corporate network. As seen on the endpoint, it is currently using a policy version of 6 and has not updated since. Press the Update button to manually initiate an update check. You will see that the time for the updated string has changed, and checking back, the policy version is now 7. Allow time for the endpoint status table to update, as the WebSense Data Batch Server service handles the update of endpoint status, which is handled in batch intervals. Once the table has been updated with the most recent information, the endpoint will appear synced if all of the various versions match. On older versions of the endpoint prior to the endpoint 1 endpoint and versions of the DLP manager prior to 8.6, the synchronization status may require multiple successful update checks in which there was no need for an update in order for the synced status to become green. If you feel an endpoint status entry has become stale, or there are a large amount of endpoints that are no longer in use, consider clearing the endpoint status table so that the table repopulates with only the endpoints that have been able to communicate in your network recently. In order to do this, check the endpoints you wish to remove and select the Remove option. The endpoints will repopulate as they check back in for updates, but consider making a minor policy change and pushing it out through a deployment. As the endpoints update to this new policy version, they will appear back into the table. For older versions of Forcepoint DLP prior to 8.6, there may be some improvement found in disabling the endpoint server caching. This will force the endpoint servers to collect the full information from the endpoints when they check in for updates. On each of the relevant endpoint servers, navigate to the Data Security Installation Directory and edit the endpointserver.config.xml file. Within the file, search for Disable Client Status Filtering and change the option to True. Save the file and restart the Data Web Server service in order to apply the change. This is a summary of the steps taken during this video.